Dr. Dennis Bielfeldt of the Institute of Lutheran Theology's Christ School of Theology. We are talking about philosophy in the years between now the 600s, I guess, and the 900s. Actually, we're going to go further. We'll go with the 1100s here. The first figure we want to look at is John Scotus Erigena. Okay, he's a 9th century philosopher / theologian, very creative guy. Lived from 810 to 877. Easily the most significant Irish intellectual of the early monastic period. Probably the greatest philosopher between Boethius and Anselm. Unlike his contemporaries, he actually could work with Greek, and he translated Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite into Latin, and also some of Gregory of Nyssa and Maximus the Confessor. So he was connected up with the Eastern tradition. And he was very impressed by this Neoplatonic ethos of the East, and he tried to create a systematic Christian Neoplatonism. And this is important to see because it shows us what happens when we do this. So it's an important thing to look at. He developed his cosmology from the notion of the immovable and self-identical one. Unum et ipsum immobile, right? The immovable and self-identical one that engenders all things and retrieves all things back into itself. Now, some of you are thinking about Porphyry. That's a good thing to think. Or Proclus. Yeah, you can think those thoughts with Proclus and our good friend Plotinus, right? Because, of course, he is our good friend. He's a friend for all Christian theologians, right? Because they use this kind of way of thinking during this period. And we saw a Neoplatonic element to Augustine, and certainly saw some of it in Boethius. Here it comes to full expression in John Scotus Erigena. The infinite, transcendent, and unknown, beyond being and non-being reality, through a process of self-articulation and procession, proceeds from divine darkness or non-being into the light of being. Well, you should be thinking about emanations here, right? The one emanates out of itself, and we remember that goes into nous, and nous emanates out of itself, right, into world soul, because we're always going back to Timaeus. And the world soul emanates out of itself into matter. So this is a procession of the one into the multiplicity of the world. And of course, you should see this as an ontological procession. Don't think of it so much in time as in terms of ontological dependence. So the infinite and transcendent and unknown, which is the one, right, could seem to a Christian theologian to be very much like the Father. And as the one speaks itself into the word, nous, the word, which is Christ, could be seen as a timeless speaking that brings forth the primary causes of all creation, which are the forms, right, needed for all things to be a particular thing. The causes issue, now these causes are these forms, think of them as ideas, if you will, in the thought of God or nous. Christ, right? See how nous gets kind of connected here to the notion of Christ, because Christ is Word. The causes issue in created effects, creatures, who ultimately return to their sources, which creatures return back to their sources, the causes or ideas in God. So his view here, we're going to see that it's a four-part claim. He doesn't really emphasize a world soul like was done in the Eastern traditions at the Academy and Alexandria. But he certainly is working with the notion of a transcendent one beyond all predication, issuing into the nous, which now are the forms by which all things are a particular thing. The causes or ideas, though diverse and infinite in themselves, are actually one single principle in the divine one. And you're saying, well, how can this be? Well, okay, you have a lot of thoughts, right? What are they held together by? Oh, I think them. All right, there you go. Many thoughts held together in what Kant would call the transcendental unity of apperception, right? That there's some kind of unity to all these thoughts. So, of course, Erigena knows this. God as the one, or the good, or the highest principle, transcends all things, and is thus, we could say, that non-being that transcends being. We're going to get into this, how that which is beyond being, because it's above being, is non-being, because it is not being a particular thing. All of reality is a process of exitus and reditus. Exit and return, right? Exitus und reditus. And the exitus is like a spiration, a breathing, an exhaling. I can breathe out, breathe back in. This is how God does it. He breathes out and breathes back in the universe. In a dialogue, he suggests that the highest principle is nature that includes both God and creation. And he says that this nature is the universitas rerum, that is the universe of things, including both the ea qua sunt and the ea qua non sunt, that those things which are, right, ea qua sunt, and ea qua non sunt, those things which are not. So nature includes all things, both the things that are and the things that are not. These are the kinds of thoughts that the young Bertrand Russell did not like, right? The universe concerns nature includes both the things that are and the things that are not. Okay, the divine nature now is comprised of four divisiones, divisions, which retain their unity of source. There is that which creates and is not created. Okay, so this is the uncreated creator, right? That's God, the uncreated creator. And then that which creates and is created, the created creator. Well, this is like the forms. You got to worry here because, of course, we had all these Christological controversies back in the 4th century, and of course one of them was that Christ is not created, right? There was never a time when Christ was not. Very important controversy that was settled. But I mean, if you're holding that the Word somehow is this, are all these ideas, they're created, they go out of God, and they create things because they're a necessary presupposition for any particular thing that is. So you can see that there's a tension here in the Neoplatonic way, that which is uncreated, right? Christ is certainly uncreated, tends to push towards a created. This is called classically a subordinationalist Christology, where the Son becomes less than the Father, right? And then we have that which is created and does not create, the created uncreator. These are things, right? Particular things that are created. They do not create themselves, right? Okay, so you've read Phil Hefner's, God is co-creator. Okay, this is not that. And that which is neither created nor creates. So this is the uncreated, uncreator. These are our four categories. The uncreated creator, the created creator, the created uncreator, and the uncreated uncreator. The uncreated uncreator is that which neither creates nor is created, and it's non-being and nothingness, which, as we're going to see, is also God. So hold on to your hat. He claims there are 5 ways to interpret being and non-being. Things accessible to the intellect and senses could be said to be, and anything that through its own excellence transcends this, however, is said not to be. God can thus be said not to be, because of course God is not accessible to the intellect and the senses. He is nihil per excellentiam. Excellentiam. And if you want to do it the Italian, the more ecclesiastic, and excellentiam. Anyway, he is nothing by reason of his excellence. He is beyond mere being. Things on one level regard things on another level as not being. This is another way to interpret being and non-being. For instance, the affirmatio enim hominis negatio est angeli. The affirmation, in fact, of calling someone a man is the negation that this person is an angel. The negatio vero hominis affirmatio est angeli. Angeli. Angeli, if you want to do it the more ecclesiastical way. The negation truly of a man, to negate something that something is a man, could be to affirm that person is an angel. Okay? So, this way of thinking about things could have been clarified, perhaps, if everybody had studied Aristotle more. But within the Neoplatonic tradition, obviously, non-being has a certain contour that it doesn't have in the Aristotelian tradition. Okay, then actual beings are said to be, while those resting in ideas as potential beings are said not to be. For instance, the souls of the unborn are said not to be, though they exist in secretismis naturae sinibus. They exist already in idea. The things contemplated by the intellect can be said to be, in comparison with material things, caught up in generation and corruption. So the higher notions that reason can access, these things are, but material being is not. In the same way, of course, material being comes into being and passes out of being. And of course, we'll all go back to our good friend Heraclitus, right? Everything is a perpetual perishing. And of course, this is why Plato thought that he needed to move towards this radical view. One might say it's a radical view of the forms to kind of save knowledge and any sort of permanence in this material world of flux and changing. Then we might also say that those sanctified by grace are said to be, while sinners, renouncing the divine image, are said not to be. Well, they don't participate in God. Okay, so God as the uncreated creator is the source of all being, and the uncreated uncreator is the goal of all being. Okay, and this God is nihil because God has an excellence that is above the distinction of being and non-being. So he is nihil per excellentiam here and here. Matter, as the created uncreator, is nothing because it is not whole. It's nihil per privationem. All of created beings are called nothing because they do not contain within themselves their own principle of subsistence. They exist only through the continuing activity of God. We could jump ahead to Descartes and talk about substance and how Spinoza understands substance precisely because of this issue, but we won't. So anyway, there's four modes: the uncreated creator, the created creator, the created uncreator, and the uncreated uncreator. Now, John Scotus Erigena then follows the Neoplatonic tradition in claiming that the Aristotelian categories of substance, quantity, quality, relative, time, place, etc., do not apply to God, for God transcends them. Deus est negatio omnium. God is the negation of all things. Erigena can thus speak of a super essentialis et occulta divinitas, that is, a super essential and hidden divinity. All right, so he claims that God cannot be caught, right, in the Aristotelian categories. God, and so he would be certainly plugged into what we call the apophatic, I better spell it right. One of you will say, oh, you spelled apophatic wrong. There's always one guy like that. Apophatic. The apophatic tradition claimed that saying anything of God is to say what God is not, because God is beyond anything that we can say. So if we claim something of God, we are saying something incorrect about God. So the surest way to speak correctly about God is not to say anything about God. Apophatic theology. And of course, we can connect to Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite, and the Eastern tradition here in thinking about this. God is nothingness, nihilum, whose essence is unknown to all created beings, including the angels. The angels were created, by the way. Right? He follows Maximus the Confessor. Maximus the Confessor is a thinker in the East. We won't be saying much about Maximus the Confessor in this course. Otherwise, we will never get anywhere. We still have to somehow get to the 20th century. This is looking more difficult here in the middle of March. Anyway, he follows Maximus the Confessor in saying that since God is infinite, God cannot even know himself. So God is beyond knowledge, even for God. God, because not know evil, and since all things down under, that's here, are in part evil, it might be said that God does not know anything. And this non-knowing of anything is his highest wisdom. God is just beyond it all, right? That's what makes God God. So Aristotle said that God is thought thinking itself. Well, truly, a God that is infinite is even beyond thinking himself in some way. God contains all things, and all things are outpourings of God. At this point, we need a couple pithy quotes from John Erigena that you can memorize and say to your friends. So here's the first pithy quote. The creative nature permits nothing outside itself because outside it nothing can be. Okay? Yet everything which it has created and creates it contains within itself, but in such a way that it itself is other, because it is super essential, than what it creates within itself. So all of you will be running home to try to find the paraphysion and look up this quote. But of course he's trying to talk about how the one of God. God beyond being and non-being in some sense can speak the word, which gives these forms, which are the possibility of existing objects. Another quote from our good friend Erigena: "It follows that we ought not to understand God and the creature as two things distinct from one another, but as one and the same." Now Moses wouldn't like this much. "For both the creature by subsisting is in God, and God by manifesting himself in a marvelous and ineffable manner creates himself in the creature." And this is the problem, you see, of all Neoplatonic kind of thought with the emanation. The distinction between the created order and the creative order becomes very blurry, right? And this was a continuing problem for Christianity. And of course, the doctrine of the creatio ex nihilo, that God creates out of nothing, was meant to address this issue, giving us, firm ontological divide between the divine and the creation that the divine brings about. But in Erigena, of course, this gets quite blurry. So, the problems for Erigena: he seems to get in trouble sometimes for identifying God in his creation. This is a movement towards what we might call pantheism, although it might better be said to be panentheism. And it's probably good to at least get these on the board. Basically, theism would argue that you got God there and the world there. And now that we have our language we can use, we can say that God is externally related to the world, right? Panentheism, or pantheism first, would say that God and the world, or God and universe, are all part of one thing. And that, of course, a classic pantheist would be someone like Spinoza. We're not claiming that of Erigena, although he would sometimes be called that. He's actually panentheism. He would claim that there's God, right? And then the world is somehow in God. But if you think about this, if the world is in God, then the world is internal to God. So God is internally related to the world instead of externally related to the world. So the creation gets identified with God, and if this all looks familiar to you, well, you should be thinking that this is very similar to what you've seen in Neoplatonism and the Middle Academy, that somehow we have a, shall we say, a transformation of what is God. God is what is. And in this transformation, we have the world come into being, right? But it's nestled in the infinite. Now, while this certainly does away with the absolute divide between God and the universe, if you think about this view, this is not very sacramental. The universe is out being what it is. And of course, theism is nicely can move towards deism. God creates the universe, and the universe just is what it is. And you can go out in the universe and saw things up and do whatever you want because the universe is an artifact of God. It is what it is, and God's not interfering very much in it. This is a deeply sacramental view of the universe, right? The universe is nestled in the divine bosom. So one would think that if there were environmentalism in the 9th century, that Erigena's metaphysics would make him an environmentalist, right? Because everything in the universe is, in some sense, well, of course it's nothing, but in some sense it's nothing that is an inversion of that which is the ultimate nothing, which is God. And you can think about all these nothings. He assumes a Neoplatonic progression of the universe out of God. So God goes out of himself, but of course, God really doesn't go out of himself, because to get him out of himself, God is still being God. But is this progression out of the universe, is it compatible with creation, of course, but is it also compatible with incarnation, right? Certainly, if you have this kind of thing going on, and God appears within the universe in incarnation, that's a very different kind of thing, it would seem, than this kind of thing, where the universe is already in God in some sense. So one would have to almost ask, well, gee whiz, what do we need incarnation for? Because everything is already a divine ground to everything. Our good friend Aquinas assumes a return of human beings and the universe back to God. But is this return of the universe and being back to God compatible with the Christian story, going back into Judaism, of God's salvific mighty acts in history? What is all this historical stuff that's happening? I mean, does it all have to be just read allegorically as a way of understanding the soul's return back out of itself? You got to remember, Plotinus could never forgive himself, actually, for having a body, right? He wanted to be identified with the universe, with God, right? And so, I mean, it's a very different thought world here happening. At this point, we're going to take a short break. This was a little lecture on Aquinas from the Institute of Lutheran Theology's Christ School of Theology. And we'll be back talking about some other matters before we get into another philosophical lecture a bit later. So, thank you very much.